Hello, my name is Austin Havish, the founder of Think Catholic, your source for Catholic thought with both depth and devotion, and I'd like to thank you for joining us. Joining me is Claire Nowak.
Hello.
And Dr. Ellen Phimister.
Hello.
As we continue our series on comparative religions, today with special guest Paul Williams on his journey from Buddhism to Christ. But first, the Catholic thought on the topic.
Speaking to Buddhism, the Second Vatican Council, in its decree on non-Christian religions, Nostra Aetate, states, Buddhism, in its various forms, realizes the radical insufficiency of this changeable world. It teaches a way by which men, in a devout and confident spirit, may be able either to acquire the state of perfect liberation or attain, by their own efforts or through higher help, supreme illumination. Paragraph 2.
And as a witness of that higher help which draws men to the supreme illumination of the Christian faith in the Catholic Church, Dr. Phimister, would you like to introduce our guest?
It's a great honor to be able to introduce Paul Williams, who is a very noted scholar of Buddhism from Britain. He's the emeritus professor of Indian and Tibetan philosophy at the University of Bristol, and the founder of the Center for Buddhist Studies there, as well as the former head of the Department of Theology and Religious Studies. He is a convert to Buddhism, convert to Catholicism some years ago, and is a fully professed lay Dominican. Paul, thank you for being here.
Thank you for inviting me, guys. Actually, I was a convert to Buddhism, and I'm a convert to Catholicism, so that gives me a way of kicking off on my story, I suppose. Okay, let me see, where can we begin? I tell you what, I'd better start, I suppose, giving you a bit of chronology. I was born in 1950. Now, that should give you some idea. I was in my teens in the 60s. So there you go. Now you've got the background of my becoming a Buddhist, and a bit more to that. Okay, I was brought up in an Anglican, and when I say I was brought up an Anglican, I don't mean a nominal Anglican. I was actually very involved. I was a member of church choirs from the age of about 5, I think, until I was 16 or 17 or something like that. So I was completely involved in and absorbed the Anglican church liturgy and world of that time, and loved it, and still do. I've got affection for Anglican church music. Eventually, I became head boy of the choir, and I must just add that my voice broke when I was quite young. So I finally made it to head boy when my voice had already broken, with the result that I spent my entire time as head boy miming. And I like to joke, that gave me an early taste of the bluff needed for an academic career. Anyway, my teens, so we're talking about someone 14 or 15 or whatever, I was getting very interested in philosophy, and we're talking about 1964, 1965. I was interested in philosophy, and I started getting very interested in philosophical ideas that had grown up in a world that was not being influenced by Judeo-Christian, the Judeo-Christian ethos, and also by Greek philosophy. I should also add to that, and this is actually very relevant story, that alas, my mother died when she and I were quite young. So when I was 12, just 12, I think, I had 2 younger brothers. So I faced quite early on the issue of death and the issue of existential involvement, how to cope with life. So for me, even long before I became a Buddhist, religion was really an important part of my life, in a way which I think maybe over there in the US is more common, but over here in the UK it's not so common. So anyway, so going on into the 60s, I began to drift away from the Anglican Church. For me, looking back on it, it was very much to do with issues around God and evil. I for many, many, many years into my becoming a Buddhist, I remember saying, I could never follow a religion organized around the idea of a God because of evil. So you put that in the back of your mind, because that's playing on all the time in my story. Now, by the end of the 60s, I went to university, and I went to university to read philosophy. I always think of myself as my background has been philosophy. I'm a philosopher by training. I don't think of myself as being a theologian. I don't think of myself as being even a religious studies person. It is philosophy, hard like or hardcore philosophy. But I happened to be the only university in this country where a person doing a philosophy degree could actually do Indian philosophy. And so my interest in non-Christian philosophy, and incidentally, by that time I was already practicing meditation of the Maharishi Mahesh Yogi type, Beatles and all that. So I found myself at a university where I could study philosophy, but I could study Indian philosophy. And that's basically what I did. I did my first degree, I did everything I could do in Indian philosophy in the School of African and Asian Studies, University of Sussex. And to my astonishment, and the astonishment of just everyone around me, I was a hippie, incidentally, long hair, bells, kaftan, flowers, a lot. By the time I finished my first degree in philosophy and in Indian philosophy, and so the question then arose, what was I going to do with this thing? And I have to say, it's part of the British education system at that time that I never at any point did I ever think, what is my career going to be? Each stage led on to the next providence, if you like. Anyway, I found that to cut a long story short there, in order to do any more work in Indian philosophy, I needed the languages. And so I went to Oxford. I went to Oxford to study Sanskrit. I studied Sanskrit. I studied a little bit. I studied Pali, which is the language of a lot of the early scriptures. And finally, I settled in particular on Tibetan. So most of my subsequent academic work has been using Sanskrit, Tibetan, occasionally Pali, some Chinese. Anyone who works in Buddhist studies properly has to have a lot. And I did my DPhil at Oxford, my doctorate, at Oxford, specialising in Buddhist philosophy. And by that time in Oxford, I was, by the end of my time in Oxford, I had already actually become a Buddhist. And I became a Buddhist within the Tibetan tradition, particularly the tradition known as the Geluk tradition, which is the one of which the Dalai Lama's a direct member, partly because the Geluk tradition has always been the most academically oriented of the Buddhist, of the Tibetan traditions, the one that really goes in for, the one that's associated with the debate and having had some connection with various universities. But eventually, 1981, I came to the University of Bristol as lecturer in the philosophy of religion, and stayed here in Bristol, the most wonderful university, wonderful place. Who've not been there. And we established more posts in Buddhist studies at Bristol, set up the Centre for Buddhist Studies at the University in Bristol. I wrote, published, taught in Buddhist studies. I also did a little bit of Western philosophy teaching, and I taught various areas of what's called Hinduism. But by the end, we'd set up the centre. I was teaching Tibetan language here as well, not Sanskrit. I don't like Sanskrit. I'm not really good at it. But building up Buddhism as an academic subject, and that is relevant, because part of what I was doing then was academic. But alongside that, when I came to Bristol, we set up a Buddhist centre in Bristol, and invited a Tibetan Lama who was based on the Welsh borders to teach here in Bristol, the Lama. And eventually I was also authorised by him to teach as a Buddhist, to teach Buddhist retreats, Buddhist meditation, Buddhist things. So I had these two strings to my bow. I mean, you can be an academic in Buddhist studies without being Buddhist, of course. And you can be a Buddhist very definitely without being an academic in Buddhist studies, but I was doing both. So that by the 80s, the 90s, I suppose I would be in that category of Western academics who was also a Buddhist, working, publishing in Buddhist studies. I spent time in India, living in a Tibetan monastery in South India and also up in the north. And yes, I have met the Dalai Lama several times. And that's okay. That's that now. However, I can see you're saying, like, okay, Williams, how do you become Catholic? Now we're touching on things here which I can only look back on. Although it is included in that book I wrote about my conversion. The very fact incidentally that I felt I had to write a book to explain why I was becoming a Buddhist, why I was becoming a Catholic, when I was, some people seem to think I was described as being Buddhism's most well-known Catholic when I finally converted. Anyway, something was going on because in the background, I never hid the fact that my academic work was part of a personal search. And so now, in my work on Buddhist philosophy and my publications, or at least some of them, one of the things that I particularly wanted to do was to really work as a philosopher on Buddhism. In other words, now as a philosopher, I'm trained to think critically. And so I wasn't just expounding Buddhist ideas. In my own direct research, I was analyzing them, investigating them. And gradually, some of the key Buddhist ideas actually began to be problematic for me. And the one I particularly talk about in my conversion book, and it was really, really important to me at the time, was around the idea of reincarnation. I began to realize that if reincarnation, now look, I know there are modern Buddhists who say reincarnation is not relevant. Don't you believe? In historic terms, Buddhism is absolutely based on reincarnation or rebirth. I mean, it doesn't really matter. Let's just equate the two. I know there are some debates about it. Now, the thing that I began to realize, the Tibetan texts I was reading in Tibetan, of course, made it quite clear that if a person dies, the rebirth of that person is not the same person as the one who died. There's a link, but they're not the same person. And I began to think about this both, and this is quite clear in the sources. I began to think about this, and I also began to think about this as a philosopher. And I began to think that any understanding of reincarnation, even if it's true, would mean that a reincarnated me could not be the same person as me. For example, if I were to suddenly keel over now, given my age, my wealth, and to be reborn as a cockroach in South America, there was no sense that cockroach in South America would be me. But I also wanted to argue that there's no sense in which even if I were to keel over today and be reborn as a baby here in Bristol in my own family, it wouldn't be me. It simply wouldn't be me. And I began to realize that therefore, if any sense of reincarnation was true, death would be the end for me and for all the people I love. Now, I don't know that reincarnation is false, but I began to think, wait a minute. Throughout the Buddhist world, you've got people who think they're going to become enlightened. Actually, it's not very common in real life. In real life Buddhism, you don't really come across many people who think they're going to. But if you do become enlightened, reincarnation is not a problem for you anymore. But if you don't, reincarnation is a really serious problem. And we find throughout the Buddhist world, actually in real lived Buddhism, that Buddhists have a real problem controlling their next lives or making sure their next life will be happy. What I want to argue is that it doesn't really matter if their next life is happy because it's not them. And so I began to think to myself at this time, wait a minute, Buddhism gives me no hope. I've got no hope there. I'm not going to become enlightened. I don't look like I'm ever going to become enlightened. Do I look like a Buddha? For goodness sake. Buddhism gives me no hope. And I began to think, but my Christian friends, and I have Christian friends I'll just mention in a minute, my Christian friends have hope. Of course, I don't know that their Christian faith is true, but they've got hope. Now, I happen to be very lucky here at the University of Bristol because I happen to have as colleagues some really, really mega intelligent Christian friends. I mean, people like Herbert McCabe at that time, you know, the Dominican philosopher, used to teach in our department, and you couldn't get a cleverer guy than him, Dominican. Dennis Turner, who's, of course, over there in Yale. Brian Davies, the philosopher, who was actually one of our students. So I knew that you could have such a thing as really, really intelligent Christians. So I knew that they must be able to explain these issues. I might have a problem with God and evil, but these guys clearly don't. And they've got one additional thing, which Buddhism isn't giving me, they've got hope. And so that then got me thinking, look, I wish I could be a Christian. I wish I could believe in God. You know, I wish I could do that. I wish I could have that hope. And so that actually returns me to examining the whole issue of God. And the whole issue, of course, of God and evil. And in my book, my conversion book, The Unexpected Way, it's a personal statement. It's not an academic book. People often think, you know, they try to get me to take part in Christian Buddhist dialogue and stuff like that. The conversion book is my personal statement. It's not. When I write academic books, they don't read like that. My academic books are really boring. Conversion book's actually relatively interesting. And the first part of that book is on why I think I can believe in God. Why, at the time I wrote that book, it was believing God was as rational as the Buddhist position that there is no God. Incidentally, let's not go there on the debate. There is no form of Buddhism that believes in God in any way that is remotely can be linked to the idea of God that we have in Christianity, the idea of a creator. I mean, I could go on and on about that, but let's just not go there. And as a Buddhist, God played no part in my religious world, neither in any direct sense nor in any indirect sense. It was as rational to believe in God as it was to not believe in God as a Buddhist. I now think that it's much, 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 much more rational to believe in God. But at that time, I simply wanted to argue that it was evenly balanced, with the difference again that through believing in God, I hope. So the first stage of my conversion was, I can believe in God. Oh God, I can believe in God. This is amazing, and it's worth trying. And note incidentally that this is a purely, for me at that time, actually I need to be careful about this, it looks as if it's a purely rational thing that's happening. People sometimes say to me, you know, did you have some great white lights and, you know, things beaming down? Absolutely, wouldn't I could. So I think, for me, it looked like it was rational, but of course it wasn't really. I mean, there was a lot more going on in emotional and deeper sense. But now, okay, belief in God does not make you a Christian, let alone a Catholic. Muslims believe in God, Jews believe in God. So in the book, my next step, well, actually, in real life, I always did say that if I ever became a Christian again, it would be as a Catholic, because Herbert McCabe, Dennis Turner, Brian Davies, and so on, you know, they were my examples of intelligent Christians who could defend Christianity rationally. And that's important to me as a Dominican, incidentally. If you're going on to ask how did I become a Dominican, there you see it. But now, okay, the next stage of what I wanted to argue was, okay, then I now believe in God. Well, let's say I'm taking the God plunge, which made it say I couldn't be a Buddhist anymore. There's one form of Buddhism which does potentially answer a lot of my objections, and that's Jodo Shinshu in Japan, the Pure Land Buddhism. And I still have in my you know, one of my main academic books, as it were, my Mahayana Buddhism, my sort of big book. It's clear in that book by the time I get to the section on Joseph Schitz, I actually do have quite an admiration for Joseph Schitz. I'm not a specialist in Catholicism, but I do admire Shinran. And at one time, I was the European advisor to one of the organizations in Japan. My problem with Joseph Schitz, however, is that when you come down to it, apart from many other problems, is that it's built on a myth. It's built on a figure who never historically existed, a marker of Bodhisattva. And that might as well be a Christian. Anyway, coming back to my story, the next part of my story, however, was, okay, I now believe in God. What makes me a Christian? And part 2 of that conversion book, which remember I read a long time ago, is on the resurrection. The more I investigated the resurrection, the more it seemed to me to be more rational than not to hold that it really literally happened. And I mean by literally happened. I theologians always sort of start, I don't know if they laugh or if they start to get hot under the collar when I say this. I mean it literally happened, you know. I agree that theologically there's more to it than that, but you can sometimes say, surely you don't mean that if there'd been a camera in the tomb, they would have seen the resurrection. Well, yeah, I think I probably do, actually. But with the resurrection, I felt it made more, and that part of the book, I don't feel that part of the book is saying anything new. In fact, actually now, I think looking back on it, it's, that was me then doing that. I mean, I realise I know so much more about the resurrection now. Not particularly well written, that part of the book. I mean, I'm not really going through all the counter arguments or whatever, but nowadays I guess point people to the book by Habermas, for example, on defending the resurrection. But I absolutely found myself believing in the resurrection. Now, that meant that it made sense to me to be a Christian. Not necessarily as a logical derivation, because there's at least some Jews who accept the resurrection. But they simply say, yeah, okay, you know, Jesus was killed. He died on the tree, which shows he was accursed by God. He came back to life. Well, you know, so what? So you couldn't be a Jew and still accept the resurrection. But for me, it made sense to become a Christian. Now, okay. The next thing is, what sort of Christian? Now, I want to just back a little bit. When I tell people my story, I find that when I tell them, they nod and smile as I'm speaking, and they will go along with me at various points. And then they reach points where they start to go away. So, for example, on the bits about God, of course, the Buddhists won't go along with me. Plenty of people who go along with me on God. But then when it comes to the resurrection, you know, we're talking about the Bultmans of this world and things like that. They don't actually accept the resurrection literally happened. What's really interesting is when I get to part 3 of my story, which is why a Catholic? Because I get the Catholics who don't accept my argument for being a Catholic. Now, the Catholic is a tricky one because I certainly wasn't, at the time of my conversion, going to go through all the arguments for and against being a Catholic. Look, let me just tell you my emotions here. I was going to become a Catholic. Having really said I was going to become a Catholic. So in the sense, therefore, what's going on here is my retrospectively explaining it to myself. Now, what I wanted to argue in the book is that for me, in the Western world, nowadays, the Catholic Church is the default position as a Christian. In other words, what I argued there, and this is why Catholics often part company here, is that I needed a good knockdown argument not to be a Catholic if I was going to become a Christian. I needed someone to say, look, it's clear you can't be a Catholic for this reason, and this reason is the knockdown. And theologically, the knockdown means, for this reason, it is conclusive, or no, let's not go say conclusive. It is more rational than not that the Holy Spirit is not present in the Catholic Church. That would be the knockdown. I'll say a few words about the Orthodox Church in a minute. Now, therefore, in that part of the book, the last part, I look various arguments against being a Catholic. And then the arguments, I remember I wrote that book while I was converted. I didn't sit down, like a university professor thinking, right, I'm going to write a book about these were things that actually I'd be walking the hills, or I'd be walking to church or whatever, and an argument would come to me against it. Or someone would say to me, people would say to me, you must be mad, you can't become a Catholic, for goodness sake. And I wrestle with that. But instead of simply doing it intellectually, I would write down what I thought, and somehow it got assembled into it. So people would argue, well, you can't because, and they would give all the usual arguments, the papacy and the abortion and contraception and all that sort of stuff. My brother would say, but it's just mad. I remember at the university, someone was heard to say in one of the corridors, the professor of Buddhist studies, as they thought I was, he's become a Catholic. You could understand it if it was the other way around. Well, what I found was that in that last section of the book, I found myself, in some cases, I found that the counter-arguments being a Catholic were simply not knockdown arguments. I mean, if you think about it, I didn't want to get bogged down in the debates around contraception, abortion, all that sort of thing, or papal supremacy or whatever. Actually, papal supremacy is a more clear-cut case, but I didn't want to get them bogged down in it. I simply want to say, he's going to give me knockdown arguments to say the Holy Spirit is not a Catholic Church. But sometimes I found the arguments actually convinced me the other way. In other words, that the Catholic Church was convincing. I mean, I find papal supremacy, for example, no problems whatsoever with that. Now, okay, so we're coming towards the end of my conversion story. What I also find towards the end of that book is this. I was very influenced, I mentioned in the book, I was very influenced by the case, which I believe may not be quite as true as it sometimes has been, but at the time I thought it was, one of these awful shootings that you have over there in the States, in one of the schools. I think it was the Ohio one. Anyway, one of those. The shooter pointed a gun at some young lady's head and said, "Do you believe in God?" She said yes, and they blew her brains out. Now, in the last analysis, I wanted to say in that book, and I think I still do, well, I do say it then, it's as if we got the gun to the head. Yes or no? You can't. I'm used to analysing. I'm used to thinking. My natural tendency would be to say, well, all that's there. No, I'd better go back and see if, all my premises lead to the conclusions. And or someone would subsequently come along and say, hang on, I've got a knockdown argument against the Catholic Church. No. Eventually, I wrote that book the year I turned 50. I'm now mid-70s. At some point along the line, it's as if you've got a gun put in your head, yes or no. And the decision you make is one that you've got to make. And so, as I said at the end of the book, I had to say yes. I couldn't say no. And what's more, I now want to say I've never remotely regretted it. One of my students at the time said, "We knew you were a Catholic all along, really." But no, I've never remotely regretted it, becoming a Catholic. And so the question I suppose you might ask is then why was I Buddhist all those years? And I do think that it is bound up with my search, of course, bound up with the way the Lord has led me. I quite often nowadays get people contacting me whose children, people in the States, whose children were brought up as Catholics and they're now becoming Buddhists. What do I think? I think good luck to them. I think that's the Lord who lead them that way. There's no problem. He led me that way. I have no problems with that whatsoever. In fact, in many ways, I think it's a good sign, actually, that their offspring are starting to think through these issues. But I do think in my own story that as an academic, a leftover hippie from the 60s, an academic working in Buddhist studies, I think I'm tempted to say it gave you a bit of kudos. It gave you a bit of, but I think that would be unfair to myself. I think it gave me a sort of claim on what my academic interests really were about, which was about a spiritual quest, in that people would know that as well as writing all these books about Buddhism, I was also a Buddhist. And I taught as a Buddhist. And I taught Buddhist retreats. I taught Buddhist meditation. I taught Buddhist philosophy in Buddhist centers. I was authorized to be a Buddhist. So I think, you know, that was part of my story. I don't think I have any problems with that. But since becoming a Catholic, I'm totally at home as a Catholic. Now, finally, Dominican. Why Dominican? Well, I want to say just a few words because I want to do this quickly because I know that time is a premium here. You can already see from my story why I might be attracted by the Dominicans. The Dominicans are the part of the church which is academic, which sets out to defend the church, to defend the faith, which considers that the Christian faith is defensible, beautiful, true, and all those things. Dominicans are people who will. I mean, the Dominican order is founded on the idea of reasoning and the idea of debate and the idea of showing the truth of the faith. So that's one reason why the Dominicans. Second reason why I was very influenced by Dominicans, by Herbert McCabe in particular, my word. And among them, the books that really influenced me were his book, like his God Matters, for example. But thirdly, is that perhaps in some ways a more amorphous thing, but it's actually quite important to me. When I was a Buddhist, we set up a Buddhist center here in Bristol. We would go away for retreats to Buddhist centers. We would form a group of Buddhists here in Bristol, the Dharma practitioners, the people who were members of the center. Basically, we were part of a smaller group that had a strong sense of our own identity and our own friendship and our support for each other. And when I became Catholic, I thought, well, hang on, we need more of this in the Catholic Church. We need, a lot of people become Catholics or are Catholics, and they think, you go to church, and is that it? Is there anything more? What we've done in setting up a Dominican fraternity in Bristol, it could have been a Franciscan, in this respect, is that we've created that. We have fraternity meetings, we get to know each other, we debate, we read books. We're renowned here in Bristol. I mean, an awful lot of our fraternity members are connected with the university. We're renowned for being fearsomely intellectual. We will read, we will support each other. We have a strong sense of our own identity. And there are people who, within Bristol, for example, who are looking for that and discover that that's what we're doing and that we are having no holds barred debates about the faith, about aspects of the faith. And there are people who really, really like that. One final point on that, all our fraternity meetings always end with wine. Dominicans are good with wine. And that also, you know, I mean, we've become such good friends in our fraternity, and we love each other, and we support each other. Now, there are dangers to that, of course. That can create an elitism, and we have to be careful about that. It also, but coming back to the positives, it means that as a Dominican fraternity, we're linked with the Dominicans nationally, we're linked with Oxford, we're linked with Cambridge, and we're linked internationally. And the Dominicans are one of the very few orders, I think it might be the only order, where the lay members were full members of the order from the very beginning, from the time of Dominic, or pretty well from the time of Dominic. So we are full members of the Dominican order, and that's a nice thing.
The Dominican order was effectively founded.
I'm sorry?
The Dominican order was effectively founded in a pub. I mean, in the sense that Saint Dominic was trying to convert the Cathar innkeeper when he came up with
You're absolutely right. That's right. And one of my favourite books, but let me like a book for anyone who's interested in the Dominicans. It's Paul Murray, OP's book, The New Wine of Dominican Spirituality. And it's on the use of wine, or a lot of it is done away with Dominicans are forever talking about wine. It's great. It's good. And what do I say about my story? But of course, it's easy for me to say, yeah, God was leading me throughout that. But then I like to think, our blessed Lord is still seeing me as a 5-year-old choir boy and thinking, okay, Paul, we've got John here, but we'll see you all right. We've got the 60s coming, but you'll survive. Okay, right, I'm going to shut up.
So Herbert McCabe was he used to constantly come back to the question of the problem of evil, particularly to evil being a privation. And you said that it was the problem of evil and the apparent incompatibility between the existence or the presence of evil and God that led you away from Christianity in the first place. And I mean, I don't know if this is accurate, but I mean, Buddhism is often presented in the West as essentially a philosophical answer to the question of the presence of suffering in the world. So I mean, was that key, the concept of evil being a privation?
Okay, well, there's a lot in there we could try and unpack. Okay, let's put evil being a privation to one side for the moment, because actually that's connected with the theology of how you reconcile God as creator of everything with the fact that there's evil. Because if evil's a privation, then clearly it's not created in the sense that an existent thing is created. I mean, from a Thomist point of view, everything that exists is created by God, and everything created by God is good. But if evil is a privation, in other words, an absence, in some sense is a non-entity, then you get a handle on the fact of trying to reconcile the creative power of God with that. But I don't want to go into that because it's the theology of it is complex. I think it's, I find it convincing. It needs proper unpacking. And Herbert McCabe, Brian Davies, who was a student of him, well, he was the one who's really edited and produced a lot of McCabe's work since McCabe died, has done a full book on that. But coming back to your point about Buddhism, well, we have to be terribly careful. One of the points I make as an academic is about the sheer enormous complexity of Buddhism. I mean, it's renowned for being intellectually formidable. Buddhism is in history, is incredibly diverse. My Mahayana Buddhism book pretty much starts with that and ends with that. So we need to bear in mind that Buddhism in the West, in Buddhist, in Dharma circles, is what can best be called Western Buddhism. And in fact, actually, very often nowadays, and it's certainly the case over there in the States, that so much of the input into Western Buddhism has come from, again, in inverted commas, Californian psychotherapeutic strategies that so-called Western Buddhism, in other words, what we get presented very often nowadays, what people think of as Buddhism, is really a sort of an amalgam, a veneer thing. Okay, but then having said that, coming onto that veneer thing, Buddhism is then, in many circles nowadays, presented as being a form of mindfulness, of meditation, which is good for the health, which helps calm you, and you don't bother with all those problems of the unpleasant things in life. But of course, in the background, Buddhism as a historical phenomenon was said to be the result of the Buddha, the historical Buddha, Shakyamuni Buddha's search for an end to all suffering. And therefore, at least the one common denominator throughout Buddhism is that the Buddhist goal is the end of all suffering. And I suppose that would have been something that drove me. But then, of course, the problem is that historically the Buddhist goal is and to multiculturally, the Buddhist goal is considered to be extremely difficult to attain. And of course, Buddhists believe in reincarnation. There are some Buddhist traditions that will say that in one life, although very often they will argue that that's only because of all your previous lives. And you know that this is the life you're going to make it in. But by and large, as I said earlier, the Buddhists don't consider you're going to become enlightened. It's like they don't consider, I mean, which is no very different senses of enlightenment. But they don't consider you're going to put an end to suffering. Is Buddhism good at minimizing suffering? Well, to tell you the truth, I didn't for a long time, I nowadays practice mindfulness sometimes. I mean, I find it calms me down, cheers me up. If my back is aching, and mindfulness is my back. As a goal to one's spiritual striving, I find that rather unhelpful. But and suffering is not necessarily intrinsically a bad thing, although from a Buddhist point of view, I suppose it is. Well, no, actually, even that, everything is complicated. Now, I'm not sure I've answered your questions there, Alan, but I think, in a way, the way I've tiptoed around the answer, around what I'm saying, would be an accurate tiptoe around a lot of my responses to this. Coming back to the issue of good and evil, however, as a Christian, I now consider there isn't a problem of good and evil. Or rather, as a non-Christian, the compatibility of good and evil was a major problem for me. I think that it makes more sense to put the evil to one side for the moment and then say, now, what are the good arguments for God? When you've got some good arguments for God, then say, right, okay, is evil going to be a counter argument sufficiently strong? And I was enormously influenced by Herbert McCabe's presentation of the argument, which is sort of Thomist, but it's also very much in Leibniz. The argument for why is there something wrong with nothing argument for the existence of God. I find it utterly compelling argument. I've talked about it at various points in the past. And there can be as much evil as you like. I'm looking out the window here. Here in Europe, we've got plenty of awful evil things. But that evil is not going to counter the good arguments for the existence of God. The problem is, if God exists, is that going to be how are you then going to answer evil? And I don't find that a difficult problem anymore. I really don't. I mean, I think that I think the privation argument helps. The thing that Voltaire's forever joking about, that we're living in the best of all possible worlds and God has done the best he can. No, this is not the best of all possible worlds. There's an infinite number of better worlds than this. Why did God make this one? I don't know. How on earth am I going to know the mind of God? The question is the fact that he didn't make a better one than this an argument that counters all the arguments for why God exists? Incidentally, if there is an infinite number of possible better worlds, of course, he could not logically have made the best of all possible worlds. But he could certainly make a better world than this. Yeah, of course he could. Well, at least I'm not prepared to say he couldn't have. But there are really good arguments for the existence of God. So yeah, evil happened.
St. Thomas says that in the question on the power of God. He says that there is nothing that God can make than which he could not make something greater.
Yeah, I think that makes good sense.
Yes.
I didn't remember that, but that makes good sense to me. Yeah, I mean, I was enormously influenced by Aquinas, certainly as represented to you by Herbert McCabe, and some works in that order. I mean, it essentially say in many senses in which one could say that that's what converted. In the sense that, as I said earlier, it showed me that you could be critically clever. You could be clever, and you could be clever in a critical way. You could be a philosopher and be a Christian. It saddens me when I come across people who say, Well, of course, I'm a Christian. I believe it. Buddhism's jolly clever, isn't it? But no, I'm a Christian. I believe it. It's on faith. I don't really think that it can be defended. But the great thing is that no, that's not traditional Catholicism. That's not what being a Catholic is. It might be a particular type of the other lot. Oh, I said earlier I would mention the Orthodox. I forgot to mention the Orthodox. When I was converting, the Orthodox could have tempted me. And in the book, I simply dismiss it. What I basically wanted to say in the book, and I think I still share this really, is that I had enough of the East. I wanted to come back west again. In the book, for me, it was very much a heart thing. We've got wonderful churches here in Bristol. And I look out and I see my own history as a Christian, as a Catholic, not Anglican, but as a Catholic. Yes, we have got some Orthodox churches too. Yeah? I mean, it's easier to be an Orthodox over there in the US, probably. But apart from any intellectual portion which I now have. But having said that, I very much admire. I mean, I very much admire Orthodoxy. I mean, of course, Orthodox spirituality. There's some wonderful things in it, but I'm happy as a Catholic. I must also add, because I've talked a lot about my story and becoming a Dominican, that actually one of the main influences on me in very recent times has actually been the Jesuits. I've just finished last year doing the full spiritual exercises under supervision, and as I've got older, I'm now less interested in. I don't do philosophy really anymore. I'm much more interested in my prayer life. There's a thing in India that when a person sees it's something like when a person sees his sons of his sons. Sorry about this. His sons of his sons, and his hair goes grey. It's time to renounce the world and concern oneself with the spiritual life. Well, I have to say, I actually am a great grandfather. Yes, a great grandfather. So I have the children of my children now. So I think probably I can be excused by praying more than philosophizing nowadays. But no, I've become very influenced by the Dominicans. I mean, I found that doing by Ignatius Loyola, I found that doing the spiritual exercises was, I knew it was supposed to be a very powerful thing. And I tend to always be a bit wary about experiences, but I did find absolutely jaw-droppingly powerful thing to do. I did it by what's called the 19th Amendment, which means that it stretched out over a period of 6, 7, 8 months last year.
I had this theory that in the 16th century, in order to prevent disaster, God sent Teresa and John to reform the Carmelites and the Capuchins to reform the Franciscans and Ignatius to reform the Dominicans, but he got confused and accidentally founded the church. And that's why it was a
Yeah.
I was interested by what you said about that when it came to, as it were, what form of Christianity you were thinking of.
Mm-hmm.
So you were in the company of very intellectual Catholic Dominican philosophers, but you needed strong arguments. It seemed like the burden of proof was on it. Someone who wanted to show that Catholicism wasn't the authentic form of Christianity.
Yeah.
I mean, I very much had that experience when I was converting because the only form of Christianity I'd really properly experienced was Catholicism. And it seemed to me really obvious that this is just, I mean, I wouldn't have put it like this as an 11-year-old, but it seems to be obvious this is just vanilla, as it were, Christianity. If you have to find, it doesn't make sense. The idea that a revelation has been given to be preached to the entire human race for their salvation, and then only a tiny little weird sect that preponderates in Wales or the west coast of Scotland or Alabama in fact really got it right. I mean, it just makes the whole thing absurd in the first place. Yeah. It never seemed to me. Terry Eagleton, who you mentioned before we began recording, I think I heard that he was asked once, I think after he'd come back to the practice of the Catholic faith, whether before he embraced atheism he ever considered embracing Protestantism. And if I remember correctly, he replied, "I lost my faith. I didn't lose my reason." Which is quite rude.
I could just imagine him saying that. I mean, I find it very interesting talking to people. I mean, a lot of the people I'm mixed with nowadays are people who were brought up as Catholics. My dear Dominican friend in Bristol, Fernando Cervantes, who's just written that wonderful book in Penguin on the conquistadores. And I find it tremendous hearing things from their perspective, people who were brought up as part of the faith, because I come from a very different background. On the other hand, having said that, and therefore there's a sense in which I'm outside that. Having said that, I also feel very proud of, in a way, the influence of the importance of converts, certainly in this country, in the UK, on the history of Catholicism. And actually, among the people I haven't mentioned, but I really should mention with the enormous respect, is Chesterton. I was so impressed by G.K. Chesterton. I mean, he is so prescient, so dear man, what a sweet guy, so funny. In some of it's very funny in a very British sort of way, but I mean, he is just so adorable. Really, I mean, and he's just such an influence on me. But then, Newman, of course. I was present in Birmingham when Pope Benedict did the canonization. Anyway, the other one, Pope Newman, and I was due to go to Rome for the act of canonization, but for various reasons of things to do with refugees that I was working at here, I didn't in the end.
Thank you so much, Paul. There's always so much more to say, but I want to thank you especially for your witness to the search for an answer to suffering, to death, to the problem of God and evil. Is there something we can hope in, coupled with, as we know, by prevenient grace, Christ's relentless search for you? As Jesus says, "You did not choose me, but I chose you and appointed you that you should go and bear fruit, and that your fruit should last." And so we thank God for having chosen and sought after you, Paul, for the evident fruit that has borne in your journey, and pray that it will bear similar fruit in those who are now hearing it for the first time. This is Think Catholic. My name is Austin Habish with Claire Nowak and Dr. Alan Phimister, with special guest Dr. Paul Williams. And thanks again for joining us.